Hey everyone. What a joy just to be here this morning or afternoon rather. It's still morning. I want to first of all welcome all of you here and want to thank you for coming out to support this. Especially academics, we just kind of write and publish and just move on to the next thing. We don't usually like this kind of stuff, but I think it's important as we think about the impact that our work can have to kind of find a way to communicate that beyond just the confines of academic grounds. Today, I wanted to just take about 10 minutes to run through a bit of a reflection, not necessarily a review of my book, but just a reflection of what we've done, what I've done in my book, Burning with God, which actually came out that last week. April 7th. I'm hoping that that you've kind of gotten a copy. If you are thinking about getting a copy, we have that available just at the back, and it's out there if you want to pick up a copy. And but today I wanted to talk about my work. I've known Word, for example, for almost going to more than 15, 16 years now. And it's funny because last night I kind of had to send my slide to him by forwarding the email that started the whole conversation. And it was just me, just being at Stellenbosch University, actually trying to do my graduate work on attachment to God and authenticity. And in my search, I found his dissertation, a cited dissertation. That's how that conversation started. And he sent me about 300 pages of that of his work. And to God be the glory. Now, 15 or so, 16 years, we are here. It's been a joy just knowing him personally. And yeah, it's been a good friend and a brother. Actually, I came here to Regent partly because of him. He was like, "No, you need to be a Regent." So thanks to you. Before I start my conversation, I wanted to first, usually when I talk about my work or aspects of my work, I try to first start by reflecting on my program of research. As scholars and researchers, I think it's important to have a program of research. My understanding is that I'll need a keyboard to kind of move the slides. Is that uh, Dan, keyboard? And okay, you're doing that for me. Okay. And my program of research, speak on the slides. My program of research essentially is I'm more so interested in looking at the psychological processes thinking that shape human flourishing across cultures. And when I talk about psychological processes, I'm mostly interested in four things. One is the psychospiritual processes, I guess where things like attachment to God, my walk in hope and forgiveness, all that kind of comes in. But also I'm interested in the psychosocial process. You could also say attachment comes in there as well. Psychosocial processes that help us to flourish. They are sort of mechanisms that kind of enable that. And of course, psychospatial, environmental processes that are very essential to flourishing life, regardless of culture. And most importantly, the physiological aspects, because we are people in the body, and if we're healthy physically, ultimately, we would that helps us to experience flourishing, as it were. It is. But I'm not just interested in those processes. I'm also interested in what are the things that impact or hamper those processes. So in my work, I kind of call that the disruptors, of flourishing life. However, we do know that life, it's only if you've not lived long enough that you would say that there's nothing that can stop you from flourishing. Life circumstances, can cause us sometimes to think that, we may not be flourishing, maybe not relationship with God. And some of those disruptors, I kind of talk about it in the book briefly. But also, even though that we might be predisposed to these things, we can adopt some adaptive strategies or responses, some positive adaptive strategies to help us to sort of cope and deal with whatever that we've lost, whatever disruption or struggles that we are having that is hindering us from flourishing. And when we do that, that's what flow leads to the outcomes that we are interested in. And oftentimes when, some of my colleagues, they talk about flourishing, we focus mostly they focus on the outcomes and not necessarily the processes. And for me as a psychologist, I'm also interested in the processes than actually the outcome. And so I was zooming in an aspect of my work, which is the psycho-spiritual, we call it also a psychosocial process that shape flourishing, which is, the idea of our relationship with God or attachment to God. But before that, I want to also, take a step back and really to talk about some of the questions that really led to this book. One of those, you can skip to the next slide, is why do two people believe the same thing about God? And one may perhaps feel close, and maybe the other one might feel alone, distant in their relationship with God. Now, that question in itself, when you start to think about it, you can't help but go back to the history of science, because I think part of that also could also be part of the cognitive revolution. There was a lot of, especially with the work of Rene Descartes, the Cartesian dualism, the idea of mind and body, and that conversation in itself led a lot of scientists to start to focus on cognition. That conversation led to the the cognitive revolution, and a lot of literature around what it means to become a person of faith started to center on the idea of belief, that cognitive or religious cognition, if you will, And most literatures, even in theology, even sometimes in psychology, were pointing to belief, religious cognition. What does it mean? And, most conceptualization of faith were being drawn or developed from that particular context. But belief is not the same as a bond. And so in this book, in my book, Bonding with God, it does not necessarily treat faith as a set of prepositions that one has to affirm, but as a relationship that we ought to inherit, one that shapes the same psychology that shapes every bond that we form. And so one of the things that I talk about in the book is I try to explain why two believers might experience faith so differently or may come to God in nuance or different ways. In attachment to God work, we call that the hypotheses or the pathways of attachment to God development. One of them is a compensation pathway, the other is a correspondence pathway. But also, one of the other things that I talk about in the book is we do know that as we stay in relationships, in any relationship, particularly in our relationship with God, sometimes there are things that make us feel that that relationship is not the way it should be. And we see those same experiences in our relationship with God. And so one of the things that we did in the book, when we start to have a disruption in our spiritual relationship, what actual experiences of doubt and all that, how can we reframe those? What adaptive responses can help us to kind of dilute those tensions, rather than seeing them as theological failures or moral failures. The third thing also is to try to open sort of a path to what would a secure caregiving faith look like? A secure bonding with God experience look like? And how can we really maintain that? But to talk about the structure of the book, I won't go in detail in each of them. I'll just kind of run through them and some of the key questions that is informing each of the chapters. And we hope that you can pick up the book and also read that. And if there are questions that come out of that, I'll be excited to kind of chat with you about it. But the bonding with God experience in itself starts with a search. And one of the questions that I ask in the first chapter of the book is, why do we reach for God? And what does that reaching reveal about us? Why do we want a relationship with God? How come it started? Why did it start? And sometimes, because we know that for any relationship or connection, it starts with a search. Um, Rod and I were very good friends. It started with me searching for someone that was doing some work in a particular space, and his name kind of popped up, and I reached out to him. From the point of the search and that connection, whether it's through email, what are the things that led to me, coming to you for that connection? And I think that's very important because the connection is, what does it actually look like to draw man to God? And this is where in my book we talk about the compensation and correspondence pathway. Compensation, for most people, they come to God because they're compensating for what they don't have in their human relationship. And it could come in many ways. It's not necessarily, in fact, William James talks about this as a surrender, kind of conversion. However, some correspond to that relationship. In other words, they model what they already know about relationship. If they have trusting and loving parents, they still kind of transfer that in their relationship with God. I know my friend Todd Hall kind of introduced a third dimension, which conceptually I would argue is still kind of the two that we have, the correspondence and the compensation part, to kind of address that. And but overall, when we talk to God for that connection, what happens is we'll begin to see God, because that connection, it means that, and most of us develop that connection by essentially having what is known in psychology expressing certain proximity seeking spiritual behaviors, whether it's praying, you're dealing with a crisis and you have to pray, you turn to God for that. However, what happens is at that point we start to see God as a safe haven. He becomes our refuge. And the question that I asked in chapter 3 is, where do you actually run when life breaks open? For most people, they run to things that makes them feel safe. I'm hoping that at least you run to God. Because eventually things will stress you out, eventually. But when things stress us out, most people turn to God for safety. And that repeated turn to God can make one, and I think that's where spiritual growth and spiritual transformations have to take shape. And over time, you start to trust God. And when you start to trust God, God then becomes an anchor. In psychiatric religion, we call that God becomes a secure base. He moves from just being a safe haven that you just go to when you're having problems. And so in chapter 4, I talk about what would you risk if you knew that you were fully held by God. Because it means at this point of secure base that you can launch out and do so many things. You can take risk in your calling because you know that God always has your back. But eventually, every relationship, there are things that we're exposed to that can disrupt our relationship. Even in friendship circle, your friend can move to a different place. Your friend can relocate, or there might be disagreements in relationships. The problem is not that the relationship is no longer there. It's just that the atonement level has sort of shifted. In some other of my work, I try to use this as a pathway to talk about radicalization, which is not what we're talking about today. But especially in our bonding experience with God, what do you do when God goes quiet? And when that happens, actually, we respond in many ways. In John Bowlby in Attachment Theory, when he wrote Practice Work of Loss, he talks about 3 reparative responses. The first thing we do is that we protest. Protesting could come in many ways. For some people, it could mean writing something on social media. We saw that during COVID. So I also studied place attachment. When people were all in lockdown, what happened? Most people started to rant on social media about the lockdown. Most people couldn't help themselves. They moved beyond protest and ended up in despair. Despair is the second phase. Despair essentially is where you feel like you've lost that connection. In fact, most people at the despair phase can become violent. Sometimes they can, depending again on their attachment patterns, they can be completely withdrawn, or maybe you might try to cling on to this thing that is no longer there. But in our relationship with God, it really is different because that is really the disruption is necessary for our transformation. Because this is the point where God wants to grow us in faith. And so there are some struggles, some things that will disrupt our perceived relationship with God. And sometimes, remember, we come into that relationship with a relational baggage. It could mean how you've been seeing your parents and you're transferring that with God. But at the disruptors phase, God is working, and I think that's where the spiritual formation kind of happens. He is working to try to break us. When I say break us, not in a negative sense, but so that we can really come out pure and whole and start to see Him for who He is. And in chapter 6 of Bonding with God, I talk about the transformation. What happens when this particular bond breaks and how it can be rebuilt. And there I talk about spiritual attachment disruption, which I think if I'm to think about what the next direction in our walking with God, I will say that is the conversation around what does it mean when people experience spiritual attachment disruption. And I think you could understand that in many ways. Some call it the construction. It could mean someone leaving their faith community. It could mean a crisis of faith. It could mean some sort of spiritual struggles. And, I feel most of the literature and the construction kind of could fold into that. Because what essentially is happening is that this person is questioning what they understand about God and try to understand God for themselves. And that transformation is really what leads to the next phase, which is the formation. Who you have become and what has your God bond made of you. And the last phase of this process is the renewal phase. You could say that's where spiritual flourishing takes shape, because now what happens here, the question that I asked in this last chapter is, what does it look like to overflow and to give what you have received? And this is where I introduce the concept of caregiving faith. That now that we've experienced and received this caregiving love and nurturing from God, now it's our time to do that for others. I won't go through the other slides because I think I've kind of covered, but you could skip
Words.
Yeah, just keep going.
We can share slides too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can leave it here.
Go back. Or one more. Go back.
Yeah. And essentially, when you come to the point where you experience God for yourself, and you come to that renewal phase, it's interesting because our School of Divinity, the focus is on renewal. And I think for us to experience renewal, we must come to a place where we have a secure, bonding experience with God. I think that's the secret of spiritual flourishing. And caregiving faith, in the sense, involves two things. One is receiving God experience as a loving, reliable partner, a secure base that shelters and sends us, the bond that holds you through silence, struggle, and renewal. At this point, you know who the Lord God is for you because you've been through the process. And you transcended beyond just seeing that as a secure base, but through the struggle, something new has come out of you, and you're pouring out this new wine. But most importantly, it's not that you're just receiving that caregiving, you're also giving it because you've been held by God. Now you become a conduit of that same care towards others. Love receives becomes love extended. And this is really what caregiving faith is all about. In one of the chapters in the book, I did put this in there, say, in caring for others, we become mirrors of God's love, reflecting what we ourselves long to receive. However, we can express a caregiving faith without going through a spiritual formation process. Essentially, from the point of disruption to transformation and formation, what is happening there? There's a spiritual formation process going on. And what is spiritual formation? I was like the formation, the process of being conformed to the image of God for the sake of others. And that's really what's happening. The disruption have to happen so that we can experience transformation. And through that, there's a character formation that's taking place that make us who we should become. I'll stop here and invite my friend Ward Davis. And one of the things that I try to do in my book is to bring in the academic work that I've done, the research, but at the same time talk about it in a practical way, so that leaders, pastors, anyone can pick up this material and how people understand their faith experience, the bonding with God, and how that works in reality and what the process entails. And for most of us that might be going through a particular disruptive phase in our faith experience, it is part of the plan to get you to where God wants you to be so you know Him for yourself. So, my friend.
Thank you, Dr. Compton. It is a joy to be with you on this occasion, and a great joy also to be back here with my other dear friend, Dr. Corné Bekker, and with so many of you that I've known for a while. So my name is Dr. Ward Davis. I am at Wheaton College, and I am going to share a little bit about a book that Dr. Per Grankvist at Stockholm University and I just finished, and I'll share just a super quick summary. We can go to the next slide just to summarize. Maybe, hey, no problem.
There you go.
All right, so this is summarizing the book in 1 minute. And you can tell me. So the core idea is that spiritual flourishing is deeply relational. And it is also deeply experiential. Spiritual formation and spiritual flourishing are very much tied to our emotions and our relationships. And we all as humans seek closeness to others. In fact, many non-human animals do as well. And so you see just this innate human need for closeness, attachment, safety, security, and bonding. And we seek others in the same way that Dr. Cowan was talking about, as to be a safe haven for us and a secure base for us during times of perceived threat or actual threat, in times of sickness, in times of strain, in times of loneliness, in times of frustration. Anytime that we are disrupted, we seek others in order to help hold us, to help heal us. And these patterns that form are called attachment patterns or attachment styles, attachment dispositions. And they shape how we regulate emotions, how we relate to each other, how we define ourselves and kind of what we're about and how we live, and also how we flourish or how we struggle to flourish. So these relationships and these attachment bonds are really central to us as humans. And they also, of course, by extension, are essential and very, very foundational to who we are as spiritual beings and Christians. Religion and spirituality often is going to operate through the same attachment systems and patterns that we use to navigate relationships in general. And so that is just a way to understand that most of your religion and spirituality is probably strongly influenced by how your brain and body have been trained to relate with yourself and others. It is very intertwined. So let's go to the next slide. Mr. Daniel, thank you. All right, so for many people around the world, most people around the world, I think it's about 80% of people espouse some form of religion or spirituality. I think it's a third of people in the world adhere to Christianity. And Christianity, of all the world faiths, is probably the most relational in its emphasis and theology. But also some of the other major world faiths, like Judaism and some segments of Islam, are also quite relational. And then some elements of Eastern spirituality, some elements of indigenous spiritualities are often relational and can be looked at through an attachment lens and are often in lived experience or embodied in an attachment way. But some faiths are not as do not lend themselves as much towards attachment as a way to understand that religion or that practice or belief. And so it's just important for us to know that. But as we are approaching religion and spirituality as Christians, we often are approaching in a way that lends itself towards attachment. We do view our fellow Christians as people who are made in the image of God, as people with whom God has created us to connect, to love, to give and receive love, that kind of caregiving faith that Dr. Counter is talking about. And so we do often experience God as an attachment figure, this irreplaceable figure that we have this strong emotional bond with. And we go to God in these times of distress or strain as a safe haven. And then if we are seeking to try new things, like we're starting a new school, or we're going off on to a predoctoral psychology internship, just as a hypothetical thing that some of you are about to do. You rely on God as a secure base, a person, a being who is with you, who is holding you, who is encouraging you and cheerleading you. And that is kind of the essence of a lot of people's relationship with God, is relying on God as a safe haven, secure base, and then seeking proximity to God through prayer, worship, group prayer, group gathering together as a way to just maintain that connection with God. People can develop a secure bond with God that is very grounded in being loved, being safe, being secure. They also can develop an insecure bond with God, even as they have developed perhaps an insecure bond with others, where there's just not a sense, is God safe? Are others safe? Am I loved? Is God available? Are others available? And then sometimes people can experience trauma. Many people experience trauma in this life. Pretty much all of us experience it to some level and in many different ways, but some people experience a level of trauma that is just unfathomable. And they do so over and over and over, or their family has done experience trauma and it's passed down even genetically to them. And it makes attachment to anybody, including an invisible being such as God, very difficult, because the attachment patterns that have been laid on in their mind and body are quite dysregulated or quite incoherent. And there's just this disorienting layer of their mind, a foundation of their mind that makes attaching to others or loving themselves and understanding themselves or loving and relating with God very, very difficult. So there are insecure or disorganized bonds that develop between others and God. And how can those heal? Can they heal? These are the questions that we, as mental health practitioners, as pastoral figures, as spiritual directors, these are what we wrestle with. Because we have hope that people can heal, that they do heal. And how can we journey with them to help make that possible? Transformation in human attachment patterns can lead to transformation in people's attachment to God, and vice versa. There are many people who have had horrific experiences in their lives and relationships. And through their relationship with God, they are able to heal. Maybe not fully in this life, maybe not to a place where they're no longer experiencing traumatic symptoms or anxiety or depression or intense fear, but they heal to a place where they can function and flourish at a level their heart yearns to. And that is the honor that we have as practitioners, is to help them get there, and pastors and spiritual directors. But this transformation can also happen through healthy relationships. And that's probably primarily how it happens for most people. The transformation from insecurity or attachment disorganization towards greater security oftentimes is going to happen through people. That highlights the importance of healthy friendships, healthy marriages, healthy churches, healthy groups, healthy cohorts. That is going to be the avenue through which people develop healthy attachment patterns. And then through that, they oftentimes are able to see and experience God in a healthier way. we're going to get. I think the rest of this is okay. We'll talk a little bit about correspondence and compensation. My friend Dr. County has talked some about that. Essentially, there are two ways to think about the relationship between people's human attachment patterns and their divine attachment patterns. One is called the correspondence hypothesis, and just think about it. Kind of go back to your math days. Think about it as a parallelogram. Like they're both parallel. So basically, your human attachment patterns and your divine attachment patterns are parallel. They are generally secure or generally insecure. And then within insecurity can be disorganization as well. If you have a disorganized attachment to others, oftentimes it just makes it very, very difficult for you to have an organized and secure attachment pattern with God. It's not impossible. It's just probably going to need intervention to get you to that place. So correspondence can be both kind of positively balanced, secure, or insecure / disorganized. Compensation, not just a person's relationship with God, but their religion and spirituality, can be engaged in an emotionally compensatory way. And that's not to say that's bad, not to say it's maladaptive. It just oftentimes people will relate to God and relate to religion in an emotionally compensatory way when they either have had a really hard attachment history or they're facing really hard circumstances. Like Nelson Mandela had a great relationship with his parents, and he yet was in prison for decades on decades on decades. And so he was in this situation where he was really struggling to have a sense of God's closeness. And so he relied on prayer, he relied on the Bible, he relied on meeting with interfaith leaders who would come to the prison. He relied on all kinds of ways that would help him nurture a faith that had a strong foundation, but was struggling situationally. And so that can be kind of a situational emotional compensation that happens for people, even if they have a secure attachment history. Oftentimes, correspondence and compensation can be true for the same person, even at the same time in their life, or it definitely can be true for the same person in different contexts. They may really have corresponding secure relationship in one context like when they're at church, surrounded by friends, family, and they're feeling good. They may have had a secure history and have a secure flourishing with God, but when they are struggling with, say, some deep addiction, that may be when they really, really struggle in their relationship with God. And their relationship with God can take on more of a darker turn that is internal, in which they internalized certain other aspects of their attachment history or certain aspects of theological education that they've been given. And so they can have more of a compensatory reaction in those times. So the same person can really experience both of these facets of attachment, both of these types of ways of how attachment patterns relate. In the past, these have been kind of poised together or poised against each other as competing hypotheses, but they both are true. They both have validity for different people in different contexts and at different times and settings. So the task for us as therapists, as pastors, as spiritual directors, is to help people move towards earned attachment security. If they have internalized attachment insecurity or disorganization, we help them earn attachment security. And that's not earned in the sense that we earn anything. We are given things by grace, but in attachment language, it's you earn something by experiencing something. So your mind and body have to experience something before you can give it. That's kind of the caregiving faith that Dr. Town was talking about. You have to experience God's love, acceptance, nearness before you can give it. And you have to experience it over and over and over because your brain and body have to be retrained after lots of experiences of the opposite of that. So let's look at a few people's lives. This was in writing this book with Dr. Perry Grankus. This is the most enjoyable part, was looking at, okay, I'm a history major and also psychology major, but I wanted to go back to history to find people from different cultures and times that illustrate key attachment dynamics. And so in this case, we wanted to illustrate that this amazing artist, Frida Kahlo, had an extremely difficult life. She had a great relationship with her father, very complicated relationship with her mother, kind of quintessential Freudian type of dynamic. But she basically she had this horrible experience after experience in her life. She became physically disabled after a really bad bus accident when she was a teenager. She got bullied a lot. She had just several deaths in the family. Wars were going on around her, Mexican War and a couple world wars. And so she had just this very kind of chaotic internal and external world. But she had a great relationship with her father. She internalized a lot of attachment security. And she also, even though she had this attachment security with her relationship with God, she also needed others. Her dad wasn't around all the time. And so she developed these attachments to this zoo of pets that she had throughout her life. She had lots and lots of pets. She had like a raccoon, a deer, lots of birds, several monkeys. She had tons of animals, and she was constantly with them and taking care of them. And they appeared in, I think it was a third of her paintings, because that she really experienced them as key attachment figures and as extensions of herself. So I just kind of wanted to include this slide to show you that there's this human need to attach to surrogates, not just parents, but to people who can step in for parents when the parent is not around, or the parent has not really been able to love in a way that you experience this caring. Let's go to the next one, because this was an example. So the poet Rumi, a Muslim poet who lived, I think it was in the 1200s. And he basically had a long migration with his family, 2,000-mile migration to modern day Turkey, Uzbekistan, and had just a lot of losses. Lost his mom, lost his dad, lost a mentor, lost his wife, lost just several key figures. And then he eventually, in kind of midlife, he had this relationship develop with this guy called Shams Al Kamsi, I believe is his last name. And they became like soulmates, and they spent all their time together. They prayed together. They like just basically literally became like soul brothers. And but his disciples, so Rumi's disciples, got so jealous of how close he was with this guy that they kidnapped the guy essentially and made him run away. And then Rumi was so despondent that they finally the disciples apologized and brought him back. But then Shams, about a year later, left for good, and we had no idea kind of where he ended up. But Rumi was very, very despondent. He was very down in the dumps. But what in the end, he started writing all the poetry, or most of the poetry that you know is Rumi's poetry now, that kind of lifts people up into the echelons of just this beauty and this self-actualization. Most of it was written during these times where he lost Shams, and he eventually, because Shams had gone, he developed this union with God relationship that he had never had. And that was what carried him through for the rest of his life, was this just really, really strong spiritual bond with God that was quite secure. And so Rumi is an example that God can really become this surrogate attachment figure, especially after you've experienced deep losses that perhaps are not going away, like the loss of a spouse, or like if you are incarcerated. That there can be this deep bond that develops with God that can carry you through. Let's go to our next version. Anne Frank, so this beloved girl of history, one of the youngest child authors, and just this inspiring figure to billions of people around the world and around cultures. She had a very interesting faith that developed. She had a Jewish faith that was primarily a mixture of her mother and her father just had a different brand of Judaism from each other. One was very kind of strict, observant, and the other was much more free, progressive, hopeful. And she kind of took on her father's more hopeful, free expression, but she also had just this determination of her mother. And she was determined to maintain her buoyancy of spiritual vitality and hope, even in the midst of the horrific situation that she was in for those 4 years. And she just wrote some of the most inspiring portions of her diary have to do with her talking about her Jewish faith and her faith in God and in humanity in the midst of just the horror of what she was experiencing. And the hope that she had is all the more inspiring because of the circumstances around her. And she's just an example that even when you are under threat, even when you're in the darkest of circumstances, that whatever attachment security has been laid down by your parents and by your other experiences, directly with God or indirectly through God's people, can really carry you through. And be a source that inspires, keeps you inspired, but also can inspire billions. Let's go to the next. Lincoln and Mother Teresa. These are people who had unbelievably difficult lives. Lincoln lost his mother was a very strong Christian and was extremely loving person, took incredible care of him out in the woods, out in the backwoods in their cabin. Father was pretty mean. Father was very, he had a lot of trauma himself. Lincoln's father had discovered his own father. He killed, like he discovered after his father gotten killed by Native Americans. And so he had just a lot of trauma, and then also just had a lot of alcohol abuse and other things. So Lincoln and his dad never really got along. They had a very contentious relationship. But he had a great relationship with his mom. Unfortunately, his mother died when he was 9 years old of a violent illness that Lincoln watched her die within a week from. And then he lost his sister, who was his best friend and really his only friend, lost her 10 years later. And then he basically had this phase of being super angry with God and angry with religion, and he was extremely blasphemous to the point that cost him a lot of career opportunities. He basically got voted down several times because of how aggressively atheist he was, shall we say. And then he lost the love of his life when they were before they were engaged. And then he did get married. His wife struggled with mental illness. Now she'd probably be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but she really struggled with a lot of things, mainly untreated mental health difficulties. They struggled in their relationship, and then they both lost one of their sons very early, and then lost another son while Lincoln was in the White House. And it was during the 1850s, leading up to the White House, after they had lost their first son, and then while he was in the Civil War, that was when his faith started to shift, and he started to become a very strong Christian. He would take the Bible with him all the time. He would quote scripture to people all the time. They wouldn't realize it. He really became this deeply spiritual man. He was very private with his spirituality. He was very spiritual, and you can see kind of how that came out in helping him get through the war. He struggled with chronic depression. His faith helped him get through the war, and he experienced all these losses. And so he really developed an earned, secure faith towards the end of his life, and it not only helped him personally, but it helped the nation to rise from the ashes of horrible war and horrible evil of slavery. And his faith was a major part of that. Mother Teresa lost her father to political assassination. He was basically killed when I think she was 15 years old. And she grew up in extreme poverty and really just had a very hard childhood. Her mother was very loving and really instilled a lot of a very caregiving faith very early. But then when she became a nun, she experienced a few years of like, okay, pretty much spiritually flourishing. But then she experienced 50 years of spiritual drought. 50 years. And she still held on to her faith. And she also was very honest in her lamenting, as you can see in her diaries. And she is just an example of you can endure faithfully even without felt security. And probably what helped hold her was her determination. She was a very feisty woman, very assertive woman. And probably her determination, so partly personality, but also partly just she had a community of people around her who were helping keep her inspired and keep her supported. So you can be held by community even in the midst of the lack of felt security. And you can feel God's love as you help, as you offer caregiving faith, even when you're not receiving. You can experience God's love to the point that God's grace helps keep you going. The last example, I don't know we'll get to, but just to speak briefly, is Oprah Winfrey. She's a fascinating person. And in a lot of Christian circles, she really is kind of, I don't know what the right word is. Criticized would be a fair word. But she is an amazing woman who I think God has used in amazing ways. Her faith looks very different than the kind of average Christian faith, but she has been a spiritual light to billions of people. And she arose from poverty, had a largely absent mother, raised by her grandmother. Her grandmother died when she was very early. And she experienced several experiences of childhood sexual abuse, one of which was by her favorite extended family member. And she was pregnant as a teenager with a child by rape. And basically, she endured horrific trauma, and then a lot of kind of racial and gender discrimination in her early career, especially. But eventually, she came to a place where her childhood Christian faith became it evolved into a different way, evolved to be a more expansive, spiritual, more universalist faith that she has used for positive good in this country and throughout many countries of the world. And one of the things that helped get her to that place was her friendship. Her friendship with Gayle King. Think what you want to about Gayle King, but she is who helped Oprah survive. And she helped Oprah heal. And it is those types of friendships that can help be a lifeline for us of God's love and mercy, and can help us become the version of ourselves that God has created us to become, and still has the capacity to help us become if we would listen to those leadings and friendship. So she earned security as well, and this kind of earned security and earned religious attachment security can look really different. And I think it's important for us as evangelicals that we can at least appreciate that God can use people even when their form of faith or their form of relationship to God looks very different than ours. That God can still use them by his great grace, and their story is beautiful and transformative. So those would be my reflections, mainly the reflections of some unbelievable men and women of history. You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity. Oh, yes. And I am going to introduce our friends online. These are three dear friends of mine, Dr. Bonnie Zoll. And so for any of you, I'm not sure of your official title, so please forgive me, but I know where you are. So I will introduce Bonnie. She is at the Templeton World Charity Foundation. Or is that correct? Yeah. Yes. and she will be giving us some comments. Dr. Laura Kaptari is at the Danielson Institute at Boston University, and she will also be sharing with us. And Dr. Everett Worthington is a professor. I do know his title, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University. I think we are first going to be hearing from Dr. Bonnie Zoll. Thank you so much, all three of you, for being here.
Thank you, Ward. I just want to check that y'all can hear me. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can? Fantastic. So thank you for this opportunity to share just my reflections on these two books and on attachment theory and its relevance and significance to Christian ministry. I'm just going to have a few minutes just sharing my reactions to the topic. I don't know if any of you remember a tract that Cru, which used to be called Campus Crusade for Christ, used to hand out. I think it's like related to the 4 laws, but the tract has an image of a train. So imagine this with me. There's a train with an engine. The second part is a coal cart, and the third is like a carriage or a caboose. And in this train, the engine is labeled fact. The coal cart in the middle is labeled faith. And the carriage or the caboose is labeled feeling. And the tract says, we rely on the promises of God's word, the fact of God's trustworthiness, not on our feelings. The Christian lives by faith, i.e. trust, this middle coal section, fuel, trust in the reliability of God himself and his word. And the tract ends, do not allow your faith to depend on your feelings. And both of the books that were discussed today show, in fact, how important feelings are, experiences, emotions are, and how they are intimately tied up with people's personal knowledge of God's trustworthiness and God's responsiveness. We've heard today that Christians, people of faith, need to not only know that God is trustworthy, they need to experience God in this way. And the books show how in understanding human psychology, we are in fact understanding the operating system that God has given to us in order that we may experience him as a real, dynamic, living God, especially in the contours of life's ups and downs. And as Christians, we take this operating system seriously, not because it might be functionally beneficial for Christian ministry, but we take it seriously because Jesus, God incarnate, was fully human. And therefore, Jesus took on human flesh. And therefore, it meant he would have had an attachment system that would have been activated by separation and loss in the way that our attachment systems are activated in this way. And so I think I've really valued how both books have taken a lot of time and care to establish just this centrality of emotion and of experience in Christian life, and how it's actually not just the caboose. It's in fact more like the train tracks on which the train itself moves. It's what makes it possible for us to develop this knowledge of God. And so, and I guess in the next few minutes, I want to invite you all into a conversation about what this means, especially this understanding of attachment patterns, and related to that, an understanding of human internal working models of self and of God affects our theory of change in ministry. So I'm borrowing this phrase theory of change from philanthropy, which is where I now work. Theories of change typically describe a set of assumptions that underpin a set of activities and why those activities are expected to lead to the changes it promises. And so in philanthropy and a lot of charitable work, a theory of change basically describes why a particular program is expected to lead to certain kinds of outcomes. And I think every ministry makes assumptions about human nature and about how God works in people's lives. And in that way, each ministry has a theory of change. And in theological terms, it means every ministry has an implicit theological anthropology and an implicit theology of grace, the ways by which God works in people's lives. And sometimes these theories of change in ministry are conscious, and sometimes they are articulated, but sometimes they're also tacit or or not expressed clearly. But the important thing is that theories have changed. People's ministries operating assumptions about what people are like and about how God works. And the means by which God works in human life affect decisions that are made on pastoral practice and on Christian experience. And so I've been reflecting on how attachment to God and our understanding of internal working models of self and of God can inform some of these assumptions. So I think it would be fair to say that many ministries focus their work on producing sanctified people. They might think it is important to do this through perhaps encouraging people to adopt spiritual exercises or formation practices. Some denominations have a very heavy emphasis on sacraments. Some ministries believe that this kind of sanctification happens through giving people lots of information from the Bible and then helping them think through the implications of that information on their own lives. But one thing that is clear from the Bible is that the transformation happens in the heart, and the centrality of the heart in the Bible is very clear. We hear about in Ezekiel, God talks about people. We talk about having hearts of flesh instead of hearts of stone. And of course, Jesus was very clearly interested in the conditions of the human heart as opposed to their outward behavior. And so I think attachment theory gives us a model for thinking about the human heart. And importantly, you cannot change heart with information alone. So it would be, I think it wouldn't be an overstatement to say that the most effective ministries are those in which people truly feel helped by God or by others in their place and times of greatest need. And so how does this thinking about the internal working models of self, what you're like and what God is like, what is this its significance as we think about the developmental trajectories of people in ministry contexts? How might understanding the significance of secure attachment and the ways in which attachment systems are activated, ways in which tensions are resolved, how does that affect, for example, how we think about what we teach children in Sunday school? What kind of internal working model of God are we helping them to form? And do we have a clear logic model in our own minds about the specific things that our children's ministries are doing in order for children to develop internal working models of God that lead to a more secure attachment to God? How does that help us think about youth ministry, especially knowing the sorts of psychological dynamics that are particularly at work in adolescence? How does it influence our response to those who express spiritual dryness and our assumptions about what is happening, what is being changed in the person, and how we think change happens? And I'm just going to end on with a little story of a recent experience I had. So a few months ago, I was speaking to 3 Catholic priests about the practice of confession, the sacrament of confession, which is quite central in the Catholic faith. And they were telling me about what they see as sort of historical mistakes that clergy have made in the 18th and 19th century, where they have made sort of the confession experience not what it's supposed to be. So they were reflecting on how in the confession booth, often in that historical period, there was the priest was communicating a image of God that was really God, a judge, and that priest felt that was their job, to be in the confession booth and to kind of almost represent God as the judge to whom you bring your sins and seek forgiveness. And it was interesting to me to hear them reflect on this and how they now notice or they're aware that might have been really actually unhelpful and might have been one of the reasons why the practice of confession sort of dropped significantly over the last century. And it was helpful to me also to hear them reflect on their own ministry of confession, where they are really prioritizing or are very actively trying to convey the image of God as a healer. And they describe growth in their ministries and the number of people seeking confession, and they attribute this really to their awareness and deliberate presentation of God, or the image of God in the confession booth as a healer rather than as a judge. And so I will just want to close with that, because it reflects to me an awareness of a theory of change that they've become an awareness of a theory of change in the confession booth, that humans change. People come and bring their needs to confess their sins to a healing God, an image of a healing God, and that the role of the priest is to facilitate this. So with that, I will end, and thank you for this opportunity to share.
Thank you, Dr. Zoll. And it's wonderful to sit with the complexities of the implications of attachment in these different domains of life. I want to speak a little bit to their relevance for psychotherapy and mental health treatment. And I think one thing that really strikes me is just how both of these books offer language to help clients understand the nuances and complexity of how they're experiencing their relationship with God or the sacred. We've heard about how clients and patients, that relationship with God is mediated by attachment processes which have roots from their early life. And as I sit with people, both as a psychologist myself and as a supervisor, I think about how those attachment internal working models are embedded within a particular body and a particular nervous system, right? So this frame of attachment roots spiritual experience in the body. It's going to be impacted by our window of tolerance, our emotion regulation capacity, and so forth. And I think that's really not just helpful, but can be transformative for folks. I'm always, I guess I shouldn't be surprised at this point, but I'm always moved and saddened in working with people who've experienced complex trauma, sometimes trauma perpetrated by religious context, how often the conclusion they come to is that God has abandoned them. And yes, that's how it experientially feels. But if you think about when any of us is living in a state of overwhelm or dissociation, when, fight or flight or freeze is kind of our set point, it's really going to be deeply challenging to feel close to anyone, right? Especially a relationship with God who we can't see and who is less tangible. And that can be a really helpful perspective, validating the complexity of folks that are experiencing the complexities and struggles that both books talked about. I think the paradigm here that clarifies that a healthy spiritual life doesn't mean one of perfect connection or peace, but that questions, doubts, and struggles are developmentally normative in response to adversity. We heard so much of that in the case examples of people throughout history, because often clients' distress is worsened when they're hearing messages that the struggle they're having is evidence of their personal failure or weak faith or even sin. So I think both these books normalize the rupture and repair micro processes that are a part of all relationships. We know this from extensive literature in early development and psychotherapy. And so what would it look like in our faith communities and in the process of psychotherapy to really center rupture and repair as like the name of the game? This is how we relate to each other. And this is how, of course, we relate to and experience God. For folks who've had chronic ruptures without repair, that's going to be really loaded up on their nervous system. So, of course, it's going to impact their experience of the sacred. We've heard a lot about the experiential and relational facets, and I love, Bonnie, what you were saying about the track on which the train runs. Um, and I found as a psychologist and supervisor and teacher, um, just how unhelpful it often is in moments where people are feeling profound disconnection from God. How unhelpful and maybe even harmful it is to go to cognition, to go to meaning, right? By reminding them in a simplistic way of God's presence, maybe pulling out a Bible verse and reminding them that God loves them. That actually increases the dissonance when that's not their felt experience, when it feels so untrue. And it can lead people to feel like something's uniquely wrong with or broken about me, that I can't feel this security right now. We actually know from research that how people experience spiritual practices, it really varies, right? So we want to be mindful of just encouraging a client to pray or whatever practice might fit within their worldview, that can actually induce distress, increase distress if we're not tracking the attachment system that's underneath that. So in these moments, sitting with people amid struggle in psychotherapy, what's often most helpful is to embody, to show rather than tell. That loving attunement, responsiveness, reliability that we heard about in both presentations, to be that and to trust the process of internalization through which earned security happens. And I learned so much from my clients and patients. I think one thing that I am continually humbled by is how incredibly risky and painful and scary it can be to open up to the possibility of connection when the harm has been so great. So with that, I'm mindful of the time, and I'll stop there and turn it over to you, Ev. Dr. Worthington.
Thank you, Laura, and good to see you, Bonnie. It's been a while. And I've enjoyed looking at the different pictures of people, so I'm glad to be back with y'all. So I really was invited to speculate about Vic's book. I didn't get to read Ward's, and I knew that my normal state of affairs would probably be a 1 hour presentation. And therefore, since I just had 5 minutes, I thought I better write this out to corral myself. So I had a period of spiritual struggle back in the early 2000s, and a lot of the things that Vic wrote about in Bonding with God rings very true from my experience. So Vic explores the theory of attachment to God, and kind of like Chuck Yeager in The Right Stuff. I don't know if you remember that movie. Some of y'all are like, yeah, was that black and white? No, it was actually a talkie. But anyway, uh, like Chuck Yeager, Vic pushes the envelope past Mach 1, which is the John Bowlby model, and past Mach 2, which is Lee Kirkpatrick's, attachment to God, and then even past Mach 3, which is Per Granquist's version. And he's racing side by side with Ward Davis toward Mach 4. So I can hardly wait for him to break the new record here. For Vic, his increase in speed is caregiver faith. I thought that was the unique idea that he had there, where faith is ultimately God is the caregiver, and ideally we should rest in that and practice also being a caregiver to others in need of support. So Vic explains how people adopt either a correspondence or a compensatory approach to God based on our primary working models as young children. God is seen as a good caretaker, like our good parent if we are in correspondence, maybe, and or a substitute if we, kind of are operating on a compensatory model. So Vic also agrees that we can adapt to important adult attachment figures. In fact, this is really kind of my life. I didn't have quite a good relationship with my father, but I married the most wonderful woman in the world. I'm sorry about you all, but you have to take second place. But Kirby just edges out everybody. So, but she actually provided a good model for me of faith, and so that was helped me develop a good, I think, a relationship with God. So Vic looks at to what happens when attachment processes are disrupted. People are thought to go through three phases. He argues: protest, despair, and detachment. And he describes how securely, anxiously, and avoidantly attached people might negotiate each of those phases. Um, Although, those are talked about as phases, it also seems to me that they could be descriptions of just a reaction that a person has, that they might not go through phases in some kind of stage model at all, but just kind of that might be the way that they're reacting. So Vic recommends that people should sit with and listen to and support those with spiritual struggles. And I think that's really congruent with my experiences. But correct theological deviations in areas that don't agree with community beliefs, values, and practices, or with a person's theological understanding of scriptures. So at this point, I didn't really know whether a friendly critique was expected, but I got beat in pickleball yesterday, and so that my curmudgeon self just got activated as I thought about this. So I thought I might offer a little friendly critique. This past year, I've been working on a theory of reconciliation that's applicable to couples and families, to organizations, and also to societies. And then recently, in particular, I've looked at Jen Ripley's and my second edition of Couple Therapy for InterVarsity. And I couldn't help but apply this lens to Vic's book. While people might think that what causes a good couple relationship is, you might think about how to complete that. What causes a good couple relationship? Often people will say, well, it's love, people who love each other, or it's people who communicate well, or, the scientifically sophisticated say, well, it's a Gottman ratio of 5 to 1 or better. But it turns out, that those are not necessarily the cause of a good relationship. They're actually signs of a good relationship. And the real cause, I think, and I think most couple therapists agree, is couples that can form, maintain, grow, and repair when damaged a strong emotional bond. And so you can see this is going to just map right onto attachment theory. So how do we treat couples who struggle with ruptured emotional bonds? Well, I think the first thing we do as a therapist, and check this out with your experiences, I think we presume that they want to reconcile until one or both of them says that reconciliation is off the table. So we're kind of implicitly working toward reconciliation from the beginning. Second, I think we apply adaptive complexity theory and to understand the disruptions. And I think adaptive complexity theory is founded on 4 basic beliefs. The first is that complex systems, which a couple relationship is a complex system, is just too complicated and multifaceted to predict. And so, no matter how much experience you have as a couple therapist, couples will surprise you. So, the second, I said four, but I'm only going to tell you three. The other is a secret, which if I told you, I'd probably have to kill you what the fourth is. So number two is that couples, like all complex systems, are self-organizing. And what that means is they want to be consistent, at least in function. They want to have a consistent function. And so when therapists have that aha moment in therapy where they have had this session that absolutely transformed this couple. This is great. I'm going to send my copy of this to Oprah, and maybe she will, air it publicly, or I might even put it on, YouTube, and get a 1 billion hits tomorrow. I've had this amazing sample or session, and then I go into the next session next week and I say, y'all remember what happened last week? And they're like, uh, can you refresh our memory? Because they've self-organized back into kind of the basic function that they were operating in before, and they have they want to be consistent. But on the other hand, the kind of the third principle is that couples and counselors working together co-evolve. And so that means that what they're doing is they are adapting alternately to each other's moves. And and so the kind of the sad thing is if I attempt a large change with a couple, what I usually get is a large resistance. If I attempt a small change, yeah. So, and you think about it, what you're asking if you attempt a large change is you're asking them to accommodate their entire belief system. And people don't want to, they want to be consistent and they want to keep that belief system. But if I attempt a small change, something like solution focused therapy, then basically what happens is they assimilate that often into their way of doing things. So basically, this attempt at reconciliation seems also to fit what happens when our relationship with God is disrupted. It's more likely unpredictable, I think, than a phase response that follows in stepwise. Our relationship is going to resist changes, especially big changes, but it will co-evolve by adapting to the Holy Spirit's prompting, to believers' responses. So many assimilations are more likely than actually a big accommodation, although obviously big accommodations happen. And I'm thinking right now of Daryl Van Tongren's book, Done, which talks about people who are abandoning the faith. So I thought Vic's book was very thought-provoking and accessible, and especially with all the case studies that he uses. Uh, so in the end, I find myself standing at the airbase, watching Vic and Ward fly off toward Mach 4 together. And then I go out and I get in my Prius and drive home. Well, thank you.
Folks, how rich this conversation indeed has been. Conversations about bonding with God, attachment theories, the abundance of monkeys, failures at pickleball, and how do we reconcile at the end of all of that. Let me just first acknowledge, folks, that this conversation has been so rich and wonderful, but we've gone over time. And so I got a long list of questions here. We're not going to do that. What I am going to do, and I'm just going to kind of pull that card right now, I'm going to ask one question for both of them and ask them to answer that. And then, folks, we will conclude at this point in time. What a rich conversation this has been. This is for both Ward and Victor, and so that they don't thumb wrestle about who goes first, I'm going to ask Ward and then Victor if they would answer this. What do you most want clinicians, pastors, and caregivers to take away from your books? First question. And where do you see the greatest gap between what the research says and what actually happens in spiritual care settings today? So 2 questions. If you could summarize, what is the main takeaway you want folks to take away? And these folks would be, of course, clinicians, pastors, caregivers. And secondly, what is the greatest gap between what the research tells us and what actually happens? Ward and then Vic.
I'll try to be incredibly succinct. I would say, and I'll try to be very biblical. Basically, love one another. If you will love one another well through Jesus, you will help those around you heal, and in turn, they'll help others heal. And where the greatest gap is how do we do that practically? Where we have very little research on how to change people's attachment patterns reliably, effectively, and deeply. And so if we can learn how to do that with different people from different cultures, from different backgrounds, different faiths, that will transform the world.
What is the biggest gap?
Biggest gap is that we don't have that research about interventions.
Yeah. I also point to the gap and then come back to the first. I think one of the gaps is the fact that I think there's a lot of work within our field in itself that just looks at the processes, that how does particular attachment patterns shape relationship with God. But although we do have some colleagues looking at spiritual struggles, but not in the language of attachment. But most importantly, understanding the fact that I think one of the things a lot of people face is when they're exposed to things like whether it's a crisis of faith or experience of the construction or exposed to religious trauma or something happening, in their life. People tend to think it's people abandoning their faith, but then it's part of the process. It's that disruptive phase that is leading somewhere. And I try to talk about that at the detachment phase. That's really what happens. So that we can really come out to become this new person that sees God as for who he is in our life. But a lot of people miss that. Now, I'm happy that Ev had mentioned a book called Done by a friend of mine, Duro. Now, it's people really done, it's that like a final statement. I have my different opinion about that. On the other hand, in terms of the first question was the key thing.
Yes, the takeaway.
The takeaway. And that's the fact that any thriving faith or spiritual flourishing, it's really as a result of an insecurity, or rather a felt security rather in our relationship with God. And once we come to a place where we have a secure bonding experience with God, a secure attachment to God, that's really, what drives spiritual flourishing. And whichever way that we can teach that, whichever way that we can study that, whichever way we can implement that across board, I think, that can have quite a significant impact in the life of people. Yeah.
Folks, thank you so much for attending today. Shall we give these 2 extraordinary scholars just a warm hand of congratulations and gratitude as we go ahead? I would encourage you to pick up both of these extraordinary texts, and I do know that Ward and Vic will both be available at the end of this. Since I'm primarily a pastor, let me close with a prayer and a benediction for all of us. Now, to him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you blameless before the presence of his glory with great joy, to the only God, our Savior, through Jesus Christ our Lord, be glory, majesty, dominion, and authority before all time, and now and forever. Amen. God bless you, folks. Have a great day.